Hello, my guest today is Dr. Tim Smith, physicist, expert on particle physics and physics data management, and the head of collaboration and information services at CERN, the European Organization for Nuclear Research. Welcome, Dr. Smith, and thank you very much for accepting our invitation. CERN's Large Hadron Collider generates an enormous volume of data every second. Your storage system capacity is about 100 petabytes. How do you handle with all that LHC data? What is the workflow behind it?
So in fact, the amount of data that we store is a small fraction of the amount of data that we generate in the collider itself. Because the collisions of our particles that counter-rotate and then collide at each of the experimental areas happen 40 million times per second, and each detector itself comprises something like 150 million sensors. So if you multiply those two numbers up, then you get petabytes per second of data flows out of the detectors around the collision point. And there's just no way that we could store or analyze that data. So in fact, the data processing workflow starts right at the side of the detector, where we have dedicated silicon that we've programmed ourselves to actually do the filtering process to bring the rate of data flowing out from the petabyte per second down to terabytes per second. We then pass it into a pipeline which are commercially available PCs, which are not far from the detectors, but they're actually in a proper computer controlled area, computer center. And thousands of processors then process the data real time and reduce the data by selecting the interesting events, reduce the data flow from the terabytes per second down to gigabytes per second. And it's that we actually transport over optical fiber to the computer center in CERN and record. So there's a whole workflow that's gone on, and our analyses have to take account of the algorithms by which we are selecting at both of those, the triggering and the filtering stages.
When dealing with big data, we realize the challenge is not only the storage itself, but also the proliferation of data as a result of reuse, for example. As well as obsolescence of media on which these data is kept. What is CERN's strategy for the long-term data preservation?
So we've been running experiments with digital readouts for quite some time, and in the early years we allowed each experiment to take the data on whatever medium they wanted, and then in the computer center we had an example of the reader for each of these storage media to make sure that we could continually read the data from the experiments. But over time this became harder and harder to keep each of these different technologies alive. So we've now gone into a strategy whereby we copy the data from where it was, on whatever media it was recorded, onto the latest technology. We have massive storage robots, tape robots, in which we copy all the data, and we have a plan of migrating it each 3 to 5 years to the latest tape technology, always keeping in the same storage enclosure, the same robots, so at least we have a good capital investment there and recovery of the costs over 30 years, hopefully. But the media themselves are changed regularly to make sure that we profit from the increased capacity that industry is capable of providing for each of these media. So this means that we actually have to continually be reading the data back out of the data stores and copying it onto the latest technologies. Because the way that we do the physics analysis is actually from the disks, the disk caches. But the disk caches are not big enough to store all of the data. So we write it onto the permanent storage media, the tapes, and then we populate the caches with the data that's being read and analyzed by the physicists at the moment. So we're forever updating the caches from tapes, but not necessarily reading all of the tapes. So what we've found now actually is that we have to, as a background process, be reading the tapes continuously to exercise the data, because we've found that the phenomena of bit rot happens, unfortunately, if you don't actually look, you don't see until the moment it becomes critical, that the data is no longer accessible. And there are 101 reasons why your data may not be there, even if you've successfully stored it, and you have checksums to check when it comes back that it's the same. It may not be have been successfully stored there. So we actually have the migration programs, and we have the data exercise programs to make sure that what we're putting there, bit by bit, is available later. But again, that's not sufficient, because of course you need format transformations as well, and all sorts of higher level operations on the data, which is a whole other problem.
So CERN not only generates huge amounts of data, but makes these data open. And to allow reusability, you need not only to open the data, but to make them retrievable and searchable and meaningful. What do you do at CERN to make these data useful?
So in fact, the Open Data Portal that we put out recently was a collaboration, a very strong collaboration between the library with all of the metadata experts and the IT department with the technical experts. So this joining together has been addressing exactly the point that you made, which is we needed the expertise to understand what we had to put into the data to make it discoverable later, to work out how we describe it so that it can be more usable and interoperable between the systems that store the information, not necessarily the data itself. That we don't do many data transformations at the moment, although for outreach purposes, where we know that it's going to leave our field and definitely be used by people who have nothing, no knowledge and no access to the tools within our field, then we do data transformations. We're trying to make tools that accompany the data, explanations of the data formats, such that people can use them in completely different environments to our own. For our own data, because it's so massive, and we've written the data formats specifically for optimized analyses within our own field, we tend to leave them in those formats and then supply the software that we have used to analyze to make that openly available so other people can use either the software alone or virtual machines containing the software to access our data. And then if they want to extend it, then they extend basically the code that we have supplied rather than writing their own from scratch, which anyway would be quite unfeasible considering the enormity of the enterprise.
So I would like to ask you now about the reuse of data that CERN produces outside physics. Reportedly, there are many spin-offs in medicine, for example, that use the data you generated. And do you track this reuse in disciplines that are different to physics? Do you expect broad interdisciplinary reuse of CERN data?
So in fact, no. We would always love people to find new uses, but because it's frontier research, the prime motive for taking the data is to understand the universe. The information is stored and saved for that purpose, and it's hard to imagine that it could be used into a completely alien environment of normal life without something that we're not thinking of at the moment, basically. So some other insight, I think, is unlikely. So what we expect more is that that people will find other uses for training their algorithms, for understanding the techniques that we've used and applying those techniques elsewhere. So it's more as an education ground, a training ground, just having data of that volume available to move it around, to test things on. So that's what we expect more than actually someone getting some insight in their daily lives from the data itself.
As for repositories, CERN is running Zenodo, and it was built in collaboration with OpenAir project. What's your assessment of the project? Is it working efficiently? Is there anything you would like to improve?
So the Zenodo was started as quite a small-scale idea to support the EC Commission's pilots, the open access pilot to start with, and then the open data pilot, as a sort of catch-all to make sure that they could put a policy up to ask people to comply with, knowing that there is somewhere that they could comply if they didn't have somewhere else at an institute to deposit things or a subject repository. So it was a small-scale thing as a catch-all. But once we'd put it up there, we saw the enthusiasm of people to use services that were actually usable, that they started to ask us for more and more features. And so we now have the problem that, in fact, we're failing to keep up with all of the interest and all of the new ideas that could be built on top, that would create new opportunities for different sciences and different reuses. So we're really keen to make it grow quickly, but at the moment it's literally a question of getting enough people to actually do the programming of the services to accept the new use cases.
So my final question would be, let's imagine that you are asked to convince, to encourage scientists to open their data. What would you say? What would be sort of incentive or bait to catch them?
I think the message is about the scientific process. I think this is the driving force that will be appreciated by most of the scientists. The process that we've evolved over the last few hundred years involves the communication of our ideas and the testing of those ideas, the falsification of those ideas by others. So the sharing of the data is just another part of that communication. It's the tools and the materials that we're using every day that we want to be communicating, exposing, showing to everyone such that they can take a look, they can help, they can build on it, they can improve it. They can help us by saying the things that weren't right in it. This is the normal process, and I think on that level the scientists appreciate that they can benefit from themselves and their own research from the sharing. But I think it has to be done in a layered approach. So you don't just say, throw it over the wall, doesn't matter what happens to it, you don't know where it is and who's going to do what. I think the layered approach says that the scientific data can be opened up to your immediate colleagues, or the colleagues that follow you down the line in your research once you have moved on. Or it's the colleagues that are in other countries that are doing similar research. And each of these levels of opening up makes them more and more comfortable, they see the benefits, and then finally, perhaps only when the publication happens might they be comfortable with opening the data up further. So I think the message that it will help them is the most powerful message that we'll get through.
Dr. Smith, thank you very much for your time and for this interesting talk.
You're welcome.